My parents skipped my graduation for my brother, so I planned the ultimate revenge they never saw coming. When my dad finally saw my picture on the news, he whispered, "Why didn't you tell us?" I just said, "Go ahead, read the headline." I'm Soren, I'm 27 years old male, and my parents skipped my law school graduation for my brother's startup launch. That single sentence is both the end of one story and the beginning of another. The first was a long, exhausting tale of trying to earn a place in my own family. The second is about how I finally learned to build a life without their approval. The foundation of that new life was laid with a simple, quiet sentence: "Go ahead, read the headline." My family operates on an unspoken caste system. At the top, basking in the perpetual sunshine of our parents' adoration, is my older brother Zane. 2 years my senior. Zane is the golden child, the prodigy, the sun around which our family orbits. He's the founder of a tech startup, a world of buzzwords and venture capital that my parents, Serafina and Thuron, find endlessly fascinating. My mother, Serafina, speaks of Zane's disruptive innovation with the kind of reverence some people reserve for religious texts. My father, Thuron, is quieter, but his pride is a tangible thing, a heavy blanket of approval that smothers everything else in the room. And then there's me. I'm the second son, the quiet one, the academic. My path was never as flashy as Zane's. It was a slow, methodical climb through books and libraries, a world of torts and statutes that my parents found at best confusing and at worst boring. They supported me in the way one might support a distant cousin, with polite, infrequent inquiries and a general sense of detachment. This dynamic wasn't a recent development. It was the bedrock of our family history, a truth so consistent it felt like a law of nature. I remember my 10th birthday vividly. I had been obsessed with astronomy for months, saving up my allowance for a telescope I'd seen in a catalog. I talked about it endlessly, leaving pictures of it on the kitchen counter. On my birthday, my parents presented me with a small, generic gift set, some books, and a model rocket. It was a nice enough gesture, but it wasn't the telescope. Later that evening, after the cake was cut, my dad clapped his hands together. "And now, a special announcement," he'd boomed. My mother then wheeled in a brand new, top-of-the-line computer for Zane. "To help with your coding projects, sweetie," she'd chirped. Zane was 12. His coding project was making a smiley face bounce around a black screen. My 10th birthday party became a celebration of Zane's new computer. I remember sitting quietly in the corner, the astronomy books feeling heavy and useless in my lap. Pattern repeated itself throughout our lives. In my junior year of high school, I was the captain of the debate team. We fought our way to the state championship, a grueling 3-day event. I had practiced for hundreds of hours, honing my arguments, anticipating rebuttals. We won. I came home with a massive trophy and a medal around my neck, my voice hoarse but my spirit soaring. I walked into the living room, and my parents were gathered around the coffee table, looking over architectural mock-ups. "Mom, Dad, we did it. We won the state championship," I said, holding up the trophy. My mother looked up, her focus barely shifting. "Oh, that's lovely, Soren, congratulations." She then immediately turned to my father. "Thuron, look at this rendering for the new server room. Zane says it's crucial for the next phase of his app development." Zane's app at the time was a simple calendar organizer he was designing for a high school competition. He hadn't even finished the prototype. My state championship trophy went on a dusty shelf in my room. The architectural renderings for Zane's imaginary server room stayed on the coffee table for a month. The most telling disparity, however, was financial. My parents had inherited a comfortable sum from my grandparents, and they invested a significant portion of it into Zane's dreams. There was seed money for his first failed startup, then more for his second. They paid for him to attend coding boot camps, networking conferences, and retreats for visionary entrepreneurs. When I decided on law school, a path with a clear, stable, and respectable outcome, the financial support evaporated. "We think it's important for you to have some skin in the game, Soren," my father had explained, a phrase I suspected Zane had taught him. "It will build character." So I built character. I worked 2 part-time jobs during my undergraduate years. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I took out substantial loans to cover the astronomical cost of law school. I lived frugally, my diet consisting mostly of ramen and coffee, while Zane posted pictures on social media from investor dinners at high-end restaurants, my parents smiling proudly beside him. I never begrudged Zane his success, but I deeply resented the fact that my ambitions were treated as a character-building exercise while his were treated as a blue-chip investment. Every grueling exam, every late night in the library, every dollar of debt I accumulated was a silent testament to their choice. They were not investing in me, they were tolerating my decisions, and I was beginning to understand that toleration was the best I could ever expect. Law school was the hardest thing I had ever done. It was a relentless intellectual gauntlet designed to break you down and rebuild you. The first year was a blur of Socratic method humiliations, 1,000-page reading assignments, and a constant low-grade fear of failure. I spent countless nights hunched over casebooks in the library's sterile silence, the words blurring together until the sun began to rise. I missed holidays, birthdays, and social gatherings, sacrificing a normal life in my mid-20s for the singular goal of earning that Juris Doctor degree. This wasn't just an academic pursuit for me, it was a personal crusade. Every A I earned, every moot court competition I won, every ounce of respect I gained from my professors was a brick in the wall of a new identity I was building for myself, one that didn't rely on my family's approval. The degree was more than a piece of paper, it was my declaration of independence. As the final semester drew to close, a genuine, unfamiliar excitement began to bubble up inside me. I had not only survived, I had thrived. I was graduating with honors, a distinction that felt like a hard-won medal. The graduation ceremony became a focal point, a finish line I had been sprinting toward for 3 years. It was a public acknowledgement of the private sacrifices I had made. Naturally, I wanted my family there. Despite everything, a small, stubborn part of me still craved their presence. I imagined them seeing me in my cap and gown, walking across that stage, finally understanding the magnitude of what I had accomplished on my own. I sent the invitations 2 months in advance. They were formal, embossed with the university's seal. I bought 2 premium guest tickets with my own money and mailed them home along with a detailed schedule of the day's events. A week later, I called them, expecting to discuss travel plans. "Oh, the invitation arrived, Soren. It's very official looking," my mother, Serafina, said. Her voice had that airy quality it always did when discussing my life, as if she were commenting on the weather in a distant country. "It's going to be a great day," I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into the conversation. "The ceremony is at the main auditorium. I'll be one of the students receiving a special commendation for my pro bono work." "That's nice, dear," she replied, the words a gentle dismissal. "Listen, about that weekend, we have some exciting news. Zane is finally launching the beta version of his new platform, Synergize." My heart sank, I knew what was coming. "He's hosting a launch party," she continued, her voice now buzzing with energy. "It's not a huge thing, just some local investors, a few tech journalists, but it's the official beginning. He's rented out a trendy little gallery space downtown. It's going to be fabulous." "Mom," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice even, "my graduation is on Saturday. I sent you the date." There was a brief pause. "Oh heavens, is it on the same day? What a funny coincidence." It wasn't a coincidence. Zane had been planning this launch for months and the date was flexible. Choosing that specific Saturday was a choice, whether conscious or not. "So you'll be there, right?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Well, Soren, this is a really critical moment for Zane," my father Thuron said, picking up the extension. "First impressions are everything in the startup world. We need to be there to support him, you understand." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. Zane's beta launch, an event with no real-world significance beyond his own ego, was critical. My graduation, the culmination of 3 years of relentless work and tens of thousands of dollars in debt, was a nice event I was expected to understand the missing. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, every conversation was the same. I would call to try and talk about my final exams or the details of the graduation, and they would pivot back to Zane within minutes. I learned about the caterer for the launch party, the color of the napkins, the specific journalists who had RSVP'd. When I mentioned I'd secured a prestigious clerkship for after the bar exam, my mother said, "That's wonderful, honey. By the way, Zane thinks he might get a write-up in a local tech blog. Can you imagine?" The hope I'd foolishly held onto began to wither. I wasn't just an afterthought, I was an inconvenience, a conflicting appointment on their calendar. The 2 premium tickets I had sent them felt like a joke. I pictured the empty seats, a stark physical representation of my place in their lives. The excitement for my big day was slowly being replaced by a cold, familiar dread. I was preparing for a celebration, but it felt like I was bracing for an impact. The morning of my graduation was bright and sunny, a perfect spring day that felt like a cruel joke. My apartment was filled with the starchy scent of my pressed academic gown. I adjusted the cap on my head, the tassel tickling my cheek. Looking in the mirror, I saw a stranger in ridiculous medieval robes. For a moment, I had to fight the urge to laugh. All this effort, all this ceremony, and the 2 people I had once wanted to impress most wouldn't even be there. My friends, a tight-knit group who had weathered the storm of law school with me, were buzzing with excitement. Their families had flown in from all over the country. There were celebratory brunches and proud parents taking endless photos. Their joy was a constant, painful reminder of what I was missing. I saved them 2 seats anyway. In the vast auditorium amongst the sea of smiling families were 2 empty chairs in the premium section, right on the aisle. It was an act of pure, irrational hope, a final, silent plea. Just before the procession was about to begin, I slipped out into the hallway and pulled out my phone. My hands were trembling slightly. I needed to hear it one last time to replace the fading hope with the cold, hard certainty I knew was waiting. I dialed my mother's number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice muffled by background noise. I could hear music and the clinking of glasses. The party. "Soren, is everything all right?" she asked, her tone laced with a slight annoyance as if I were interrupting something important. "I'm about to walk," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The ceremony is starting." "Oh right, your graduation, break a leg, sweetie, we're all thinking of you," she said, her words feeling prepackaged and hollow. I could hear my father in the background laughing at something. Then Zane's voice, loud and confident, and the key takeaway is that Synergize isn't just an app, it's an ecosystem of productivity. The sound of their world, so vibrant and complete without me, was a physical blow. The last wisp of hope inside me died, turning into something cold and sharp. "You really didn't come," I said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of a fact I was finally accepting. And then she said the words that would echo in my mind for weeks, the words that finally, irrevocably severed the cord. "Well, Soren," she said with a sigh, the sound of a patient adult explaining a simple concept to a child. "We didn't think it was a big deal compared to your brother's startup launch." A big deal. 3 years of my life, the debt of a small mortgage, the sacrifice of my youth and social life, graduating with honors from one of the top law schools in the country, not a big deal. A profound, chilling calm washed over me. It wasn't anger or sadness anymore. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when a fever breaks. For my entire life, I had been operating under the delusion that if I just tried hard enough, achieved enough, became enough, they would finally see me. I was wrong. I was looking for something in a place it would never exist. The line marshal called for us to form our lines. My moment was here. My future was waiting. "Okay, Mom," I said, and my voice was steady, devoid of the pleading tremor it had always held before. It was the voice of a stranger. "I understand now." "Good, well, have a wonderful time." I cut her off. "Then don't expect front row at the bar ceremony either." I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to. The words hung in the air between us, cold and heavy as stone. Before she could process them, before she could formulate a response, I ended the call. I slid the phone into my pocket, straightened my gown, and took my place in the procession. As the familiar notes of pomp and circumstance began to play, I walked into that auditorium with my head held high. I saw the 2 empty chairs as I passed, but for the first time they didn't represent a loss. They represented my freedom. The days following graduation were strangely silent. I expected a phone call, an angry one from my mother, a confused one from my father, but there was nothing. It was as if my final, quiet declaration had been a rock thrown into a pond and the ripples had simply vanished. The silence was their answer, and it confirmed I had made the right decision. They didn't fight for me because they didn't feel there was anything to fight for. The hollow feeling I had anticipated never fully materialized. In its place, a sense of quiet resolve began to grow. The emotional energy I had spent for over 2 decades trying to get their attention, seeking their validation, was now mine. It was a vast, untapped reserve, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. My first act of liberation was small but significant. I went into my phone's contacts. I edited my mother's entry from Mom to Serafina, ID. The same for my father, changing Dad to Thuron. It was a formal, sterile change, a reflection of the new reality. They were no longer the primary anchors of my life, they were just relatives. I stopped initiating contact. No more weekly check-in calls that were actually just me listening to the latest news about Zane. No more texts with photos of my achievements that would be met with a single, polite thumbs-up emoji. My immediate future was mapped out. 3 months of torturous, round-the-clock studying for the bar exam. But as I sat down with the mountain of prep books, I felt a profound lack of purpose. Passing the bar, getting my license, starting my clerkship, it all felt like the next logical step on a path I had chosen, but the why behind it felt suddenly flimsy. I had started this journey partly to prove something to them. Now that I had given up on that, what was my motivation? I needed to find a reason that was entirely my own. One afternoon, seeking a break from the suffocating confines of my apartment, I walked to a local coffee shop. Pinned to a corkboard amidst flyers for yoga classes and dog walkers was a small, photocopied notice. It was from a local housing advocacy group. The notice described the plight of a dozen families living in a low-income apartment building, the Oakwood Terrace, who were facing eviction. A major real estate developer had bought the property and was using a legal loophole, a technicality in the city's zoning code, to terminate their long-term leases with only 30 days' notice. The residents, many of them elderly or families with young children, had nowhere to go and no resources to fight back. The advocacy group was looking for legal volunteers. I read the flyer twice. It was a David and Goliath story, a fight against a powerful, faceless system that was steamrolling ordinary people. It resonated with a deep, familiar chord within me. I knew what it felt like to be deemed insignificant, to have your world upended by the priorities of others who held all the power. I had not yet passed the bar, so I couldn't officially represent them in court, but I could do research. I could draft documents. I could work under the supervision of the one overworked public interest lawyer running the entire advocacy group. I pulled the flyer from the board and called the number. The next day, I met with the tenants of Oakwood Terrace in the dingy community room of their building. They were teachers, nurses, and retirees. They told me stories of living in that building for 20 years, of raising their children there, of the community they had built. Their fear and desperation were palpable. They looked at me, a 27-year-old who wasn't even a licensed attorney yet, with a fragile hope that was both inspiring and terrifying. That evening, I pushed my bar exam prep books to the side. I opened my laptop and began digging into municipal zoning ordinances, case law on tenant rights, and every public document related to the developer, Titan Properties. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't working to get a grade or to impress a professor or to prove my worth to my parents. I was working for the families of Oakwood Terrace, and in their fight, I found my own. The next 6 weeks were a frantic, sleep-deprived marathon. By day, I was a bar exam candidate, cramming constitutional law and civil procedure into my brain. By night, I was a legal detective, diving deep into the labyrinthine world of property law on behalf of the Oakwood Terrace families. The two worlds bled into each other. A concept I studied for the exam in the afternoon would often be directly applicable to the case that same evening. My education was no longer theoretical, it was a weapon. The public interest lawyer I was working under, a wonderfully cynical and brilliant woman named Maria, was grateful for the help but made the stakes clear. Titan Properties has a whole floor of lawyers, Sarin, she told me over coffee one night, gesturing with a stir stick. They're designed to bleed people like us dry, to win by attrition. Our only shot is to find a silver bullet. So I hunted for one. I spent hours at the city records office, poring over dusty zoning maps and decades-old development permits. I cross-referenced property deeds and corporate filings. The families of Oakwood saw my dedication and began to trust me. They brought me binders of their old lease agreements, notices from the landlord, and correspondence going back years. The breakthrough came late one Tuesday night. I was bleary-eyed, fueled by cheap coffee, looking through the original 1970s permit for the construction of Oakwood Terrace. Tucked away in the appendices was a community benefit agreement between the original developer and the city. In exchange for a zoning variance that allowed them to build a larger building, the developer had promised to maintain a certain percentage of the units as affordable housing for Community C. Our vice workers in perpetuity. The clause was binding on all future owners of the property. My heart hammered against my ribs. Titan Properties, in its aggressive acquisition, had either missed this clause or assumed no one would ever find it. Their entire legal argument for terminating the leases rested on a zoning change from the 1990s, but this agreement predated it and by its very language superseded it. It was the silver bullet. Maria was ecstatic. We drafted an emergency injunction, and since I wasn't a lawyer yet, she argued it in court. I sat in the back of the courtroom, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. I watched the team of expensive-looking lawyers from Titan Properties scoff when Maria presented our argument. Their lead counsel, a smug man in a tailored suit, called the agreement an irrelevant and unenforceable piece of historical fiction. But the judge, an older woman with a reputation for being thorough, didn't dismiss it. She called for a 2-day recess to review the original documents. The day of the ruling was terrifying. The families from Oakwood Terrace packed the benches behind me. I could feel their collective anxiety. I hadn't told them how slim our chances were, but they knew. The judge entered and the room fell silent. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the documents before her. After careful review of the 1978 Community Benefit Agreement and its in perpetuity clause, she announced, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom, This court finds that the agreement is indeed binding on the current owners, Titan Properties. The eviction notices are hereby declared invalid. The emergency injunction is granted. A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by stifled sobs of relief. The smug look on the lead counsel's face dissolved into disbelief. The families were hugging each other, tears streaming down their faces. An elderly woman I had interviewed, Mrs. Gable, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the building for 30 years, caught my eye and mouthed the words, "Thank you." In that moment, I felt a sense of accomplishment so profound it dwarfed any academic honor I had ever received. This was real. This mattered. This victory wasn't for a grade or for a line on a resume. It was for Mrs. Gable. It was for the single mother in 3B with 2 young kids. It was for all of them. It was a victory I had earned on my own terms for a purpose I had chosen. And it was more than enough. A week after the court victory, life had settled into a new rhythm. The initial euphoria had subsided into a quiet, deep-seated satisfaction. The bar exam was just a few days away and I was back to my study schedule, but the work felt different now, less like a hurdle and more like the final step toward a future I was genuinely excited about. The families from Oakwood Terrace had thrown a small potluck party for me and Maria in the community room, showering us with gratitude and homemade food. It was more meaningful than any formal awards banquet could ever be. I hadn't spoken to my parents since the day of my graduation. I assumed they had heard nothing of my recent activities. My world had become completely separate from theirs. One afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a friend from law school. "Dude, congrats, you're famous." Attached was a photo of the front page of the city's main newspaper. My hands fumbled as I zoomed in on the image, and there it was, below the fold but still undeniably prominent. It was a picture of me standing on the courthouse steps with Maria and a beaming Mrs. Gable. But it was the headline above the photo that made the air leave my lungs. Recent graduate Soren Vance secures landmark victory for displaced families. The article detailed the entire story: the predatory developer, the obscure legal clause I had discovered, the emotional courtroom victory. It quoted Maria praising my brilliant and tireless research and Mrs. Gable calling me their guardian angel. It was surreal. Soren Vance, the quiet, overlooked son, was on the front page of the newspaper for something I had actually done, something important. A strange mix of pride and apprehension washed over me. I folded the newspaper clipping. I never sent them into a memory, a private trophy. I didn't need them to see it. Their validation was no longer the prize I was seeking. 2 days later, there was a knock on my apartment door. It was a firm, hesitant knock, not the confident rap of a friend or a delivery person. I opened the door to a sight I hadn't expected. It was my father, Thuron. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with an unfamiliar expression of turmoil. In his hand, he was holding a folded copy of the newspaper, my newspaper. "Soren," he said, his voice raspy. He stepped inside without being invited, his eyes scanning my small apartment, a space he had never seen before. He walked over to my desk, covered in law books and notes from the Oakwood case, and placed the newspaper down as if it were a fragile artifact. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a confusing mixture of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. There was awe, confusion, and something that looked painfully like guilt. He gestured toward the paper. "Serafina and we saw this." He swallowed hard. "The article, it says you're a hero." He looked at me then, his gaze direct and piercing. He whispered the question that had clearly been tormenting him since he'd seen it. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question hung in the air between us. The old Soren would have crumbled. The old Soren would have listed all the reasons, his voice thick with years of hurt. "Because you never listen. Because you don't care. Because you were busy at Zane's party." But I wasn't the old Soren anymore. I had fought a real battle and won. I had the respect of people who mattered. I didn't need to justify myself, and I didn't need to fight this battle with him. The proof was already on the table. I looked at my father, at the newspaper, and then back at him. My voice was calm, quiet, and steady. All the power in the room was mine. "Go ahead," I said. "Read the headline." Thuron stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for the familiar flicker of anger or hurt he expected to see. He found none. There was only a quiet stillness. He finally dropped his gaze to the newspaper on my desk. He unfolded it slowly, his hands unsteady. He didn't just read the headline, he read the entire article, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. He read the details of Titan Properties' scheme, the quotes from the grateful families, the praise for my work. It was as if he were seeing me for the first time, not as his son but as a person in the world, a person of consequence. When he looked up, the confusion in his eyes had been replaced by a dawning, painful understanding. "You did all this," he said, more to himself than to me, "while you were studying for the bar after he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to, after we abandoned you on your graduation day." "I did what I felt was important," I replied simply. "Your mother, she was speechless," he mumbled, running a hand through his hair. "She thought it was a different Soren Vance at first." The admission was more revealing than he intended. It confirmed that in their minds my capacity for such an achievement didn't exist. I was so firmly typecast as the secondary character in our family's story that they couldn't imagine me taking the lead. "Soren, I don't know what to say," he stammered. "We were wrong about the graduation, about a lot of things. I suppose we're proud of you, so incredibly proud." The words I had longed to hear my entire life finally came, but they landed without impact. They were a rainstorm on a house that had already been built with a waterproof roof. They were too little, too late. "Thank you," I said, and the politeness of it felt more damning than any accusation. "But I didn't do it for you, I didn't do it to make you proud." I walked over to my window and looked down at the street below. "I stopped trying to make you proud a while ago," I continued, my back to him. "I realized it was a moving target. No matter what I did, the real celebration was always happening somewhere else for someone else. So I decided to focus on my own definition of success. The families in that building have their homes. I'm about to become a licensed attorney. That's my success. Your pride is just an optional accessory." The silence in the room was heavy. I had laid down the truth of our relationship without malice or anger, just a clear statement of fact. The power dynamic had been permanently rewired. I was no longer the child seeking approval, I was the adult defining the terms of engagement. Thuron eventually left, promising that things would change, that he and Serafina would make it up to me. I knew it wouldn't be that simple. A lifetime of neglect can't be patched over with a few weeks of praise. A few days later, I passed the bar exam. The notification arrived via email and I read it with a deep sense of peace. My friends took me out to celebrate. The following week was the bar admission ceremony where I would be officially sworn in as an officer of the court. I sent out 2 invitations, one to Maria, my mentor, the other to Mrs. Gable as a representative of the Oakwood Terrace families. My parents called, asking if they could come. Serafina's voice was strained, uncertain. I told them the guest seats were already filled. I didn't do it to be cruel, but to be honest. The front row of my life was now reserved for the people who had shown up when it mattered. My future is my own now. The relationship with my parents is uncertain. Maybe over time they will learn to see me for who I am, not for who they wanted me to be. Maybe they will earn back a plaque in my life, or maybe they won't. But for the first time, it doesn't matter. My worth is not up for debate and my achievements are not dependent on their applause. I am the protagonist of my own story and the headline is just the beginning. So I want to ask you, the audience, a question. Have you ever felt overlooked, like your greatest achievements were invisible to the people who were supposed to be your biggest fans? It's a painful place to be, but it's also a place where incredible strength is forged. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop seeking validation from others and start creating it for yourself. When you do that, you don't just change your own life. You show everyone around you what you're truly made of.